Please be seated. So personally, because of this quarantine and the rules that we have here in New York City, I found myself having to self-quarantine for 14 days in the last couple of weeks. I know this has happened to many of you, and I haven't been out much, but it felt very different to actually not be allowed to do actually nothing different than I'd been doing before, but I felt it, I have to say. And I had to self-quarantine through a scheduled Sunday sermon. So I'm here this Sunday instead, which I feel very fortunate to be, but it has meant that I'm actually preaching twice today, sort of. I sent a recording to Grace Cathedral earlier this week that had been scheduled for a while to be used today, from my desk with my grandparents' pictures on the wall behind me, in front of some books, from the place that I spend most of my day, every day, on Zoom calls with many of you. And I'm here today. And when I told Mother Beth about this quarantine, I sort of knew it was coming, I wasn't sure, I was surprised. She suggested this way to make the schedule change. Instead of, there are many, many ways you can suggest how you make a shift like this. She just wrote, Shifra and Pua, big exclamation point. So if any Sunday has many, many sermons to be preached, it would be this Sunday, Shifra and Pua, and Peter the Rock, upon which Jesus, the new Moses, the Messiah, shall build the church. I got an email inquiry last week from a man taking an online class about church. I don't know him. He lives in one of the Trinity buildings and got my contact information, but taking the kind of class that many of us are these days about something we just don't know a lot about or curious about, haven't had time in the past to think about. His assignment was to interview two ministers from very different Christian traditions about how their community approaches worship. What do we do every week, and where do these practices come from, and what do those things have to do with the Bible, if anything? There's a little bit of chat on Twitter about that in Episcopal circles right now as well. Lots of people are thinking about that. These questions hold within them some interesting assumptions that I could have unpacked for him by email, but I've never actually met him in person. It's about how different communities, different kinds of Christian communities, have arrived at what we do every week, what our Sundays look like, which has a lot to do with our origins and those relationships to power, who authorized worship historically, the monarch or a local preacher or a little community, and a lot to do with access to the Bible and the local language and where in history our practices began. As well, of course, as whether your tradition was founded with consent or in resistance to power at the time locally, particularly in the West, but also throughout all of the colonies. So I was thinking about all that and started to write it. It was a long paragraph, and then I thought, actually, that isn't probably going to help his grade very much, and he needs to get a good grade in this. I've not met this person. I want to make a good impression. So I wrote him about how we get access to as much of the Bible as possible in the lectionary and the prayer book as Episcopalians, that's part of our agenda, how we tell a story in our worship, and how we hope that that will shape our living as we discern where God is to be found among us, in the transformative mysteries of Eucharistic practice, at its best, a ritual that is a remaking of ourselves day after day, or at the least week after week, as individuals and as communities, to carry the vision of God's utterly revolutionary, justice-bearing, creative love into the lived reality of our time. Where hope and history rhyme, in the words of Seamus Haney. Mr. Biden used that language earlier this week, and I think it warmed the hearts of every Episcopal priest I know. So many of us lean on this quote regularly. So I'm not a person who believes that any political party will bring God's promised reign of justice and peace to us, and I don't know anyone that actually believes that. But I also have ears to hear and eyes to see, a Bible to read, and a liturgy to pray, filled with words of justice and compassion for the foreigner, the immigrant, the needy, the outsider, the widow, the orphan, the hungry, the enslaved, the conquered, the imprisoned, and words of judgment for those who prosper on the backs of the poor. And really no words, none, about personal property as the proof of faithfulness, no words at all about individual liberty or gun ownership or discrimination as the foundational rights of communities that seek to live faithfully as Christians. And so much language, so many words about how people who follow these ways, the revelation of God, must be concerned about how their communities are organized for the good. So Shifra and Pua. There was a time after Joseph, it says, when the Hebrew people, the descendants of Jacob, the literal children of Israel, were many, enough that they might be called a people, a nation. And somehow those people were distinct enough. We don't know if that was by sight, what they looked like, or language, or some custom they had, or name, or dress, but somehow they were distinct, maybe just having remained upon the land given to their ancestors when they came to Egypt to flee famine, seeking a safe haven in a place where their relative had a very good job, from a place promised to them by God, but in which they could not find the sustenance to live. Ancient refugees. The Pharaoh is worried about their number, it says. You have to wonder if there was more to it, but this is all we have. The story says that he enslaves them in place. They did not start out as slaves. No one does. They were enslaved. And the injustice of the slavery was its brutality. And it is noted how quickly the people, all of them, adjust to the brutality, the slaver and the enslaved. The Pharaoh's endgame is to wipe them out as a people. He calls upon the midwives to murder the baby boys immediately after they are born. And when they do not do it, Shiphrah and Puah and all of their colleagues do not do it. They do not say they will not or do not. They say they cannot because of the strength, the mightiness of Hebrew women who are quick to give birth and get out of there with their babies. The strength of the Hebrew women. They are saving their own sons, the midwives say. We cannot murder them. There is enough truth in that, but you can also hear where there's not. So when they do not, the Pharaoh deputizes every last Egyptian to murder Hebrew baby boys. Anyone, everyone. Like a nation of Karens and whatever we're calling the men who call the police on people of color for simply living, right? Like every police encounter of an unarmed person on video, on a front porch in a park, on the street, in their home. Everyone, every Egyptian is charged with the folly of the Pharaoh's fear that this people will replace him. Shiphrah and Puah survive in this story, by which I mean they literally keep living. The Pharaoh does not kill them for their defiance. We don't know why, and we tell their story. They make it into the Bible, and you have to wonder what we are to learn from them. The lectionary, this schedule that determines what we read in worship, actually hands it to us on a platter. We don't read this in isolation. Jesus says today, I am the Messiah, which literally means the new Moses. The stone upon which I will build my church will be simple people who have seen my power to call up the prophetic memories and futures of our people, he says to the utterly unremarkable Simon Peter. A new heart and a new mind is what comes with faith, we hear today. Be ye transformed, read the old version. Be ye transformed by the renewing of your minds. The Christian life happens in bodies, in skin and bones and blood, on land and water, in time, in history. It is here around us. There is a record of our trying over the generations. There is a record of our failing and stumbling. There will be a record of our reckoning in this time. Friends, search this record for the cracks in what might seem like the long, slow march of tyranny. There is, after all, a Shiphrah and a Puah. Not impressed with the courts of the Pharaoh, it must have been a dazzling place for a slave to come, who might have summoned up just enough courage to say those carefully planned words. You know they worked. You know they labored over what they would say when they were called back. You know they were risking their lives in the doing and in the saying, words that lifted up the power of their women. What a powerful way to do this. Words that are so shockingly positive and powerful, speaking a truth. Can you imagine the power of those women knowing their sons were doomed, vulnerable to murder at anyone's hands? And what a truth to proclaim. We cannot stop them from giving life. A moral truth, a principled action, a shrewd defiance that left the possibility that they would survive, hope against hope. They didn't say no. They brilliantly used the misperception of the Pharaoh, of their lack of capacity, their lack of cleverness, their lack of brilliance, his underestimation of them, built upon an argument of the mightiness of Hebrew women, to save their people. These readings can zoom right forward through the timelines of history and land right here in 2020 as a window into the world we live in today. The blustering, inept cruelty of the fearful, powerful, through time and today. The whipping up of fear. The last presidential election, the first one I remember it from was when I was a child, was George Bush and Willie Horton, right? And it has been a cycle before and after, every time, right? If we need to generate fear, we say black bodies, foreigners, the poor, at some point queer folks, of some women, those that are not them, deputized, every last one of them, to take our rights, our opportunities, our very lives, for the perpetuation of the power of the fearful. The Pharaoh was afraid, it says, he had forgotten. Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, Audre Lorde, James Baldwin, Shirley Chisholm, Pauli Murray, Barbara Jordan, Ida B. Wells. He had forgotten the promises of his predecessors. He did not know what had saved his people, his nation, in the past. He could not imagine the promise of a glory unrealized. He only saw threat. And so the midwives, they kept doing what they had always done. They brought the wisdom of generations of women to the birthstone and guaranteed a future for this now enslaved people. And they did what the oppressed have always done and worked every angle to protect and preserve the possibilities of an unimaginable future. Or maybe that's wrong. Maybe it is that they imagined an impossible future and believed that life was worth living, that new life was worth it. And of their shrewd, maybe even nasty persistence, the baby Moses is born, protected by his sister Miriam, who in her cleverness restores her mother's broken heart, restores her little inconsequential family, and makes the way for liberation for all of her people. Today, Jesus says, "Who do you say that I am? You who have seen me teach and heal and pray and struggle." And Peter says, "You are the new Moses." Invoking the story we read today and everything before it and after it that we are reading in this season, a story well known by the people for whom these texts were first written. We are so many generations and cultures away from that time that there are parts that we probably cannot see that we're missing. So we frame these readings in prayers and other readings and songs. We have this liturgy that brings us to this table to remember nothing less than the holy, revolutionary, world-shattering, death-defying, unfathomably freeing, liberating, life-blessing power of God creating is our promise, is our hope. And so you and I stand here in history with a great task of freedom in front of us, with hope in our eyes and praise in our hearts, standing firmly upon these polished stones, these stones that evoke the brick quarries of Egypt, the birthstones of the mighty Shiphrah and Puah, the cornerstone rejected, the stones of bridges and walls, the schist underneath this great city, the foundations, the resistance, the uprising, the poetry of hope and holy defiance that with God's blessing will be our witness in history. Amen.